Good morning all. Thank you so much for joining the Plant Life Spring into Action webinar about Ranscombe Farm in Kent. Thank you so much for joining us on what is, at least where I'm sitting, a beautiful spring day. So good day to find out what's going on one of our key sites. The main presenter today is, as you'll see, is Ben Sweeney. I'm Alistair Morley. I'm going to co-host. You won't be able we won't be able to hear you, but if you've got questions about the sort of Zoom process or any problems with it, if you can please use the chat function, and we've got a member of staff who's helping to sort of facilitate that. If you've got questions about the content of the presentation from Ben, then please use the Q&A and we'll answer as many of those as we can, and we should have 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to ask Ben to put some of those questions to Ben. The presentation is going to last about 3/4 of an hour, so with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben to start his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Al. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be talking to you about restoring flower-rich landscapes in the working landscape of Ranscombe Farm, which has been Plant Life's flagship nature reserve since 2005. It's a site that is owned in part by Plant Life and in part by the local authority Medway Council, but managed by Plant Life in partnership with our tenant farmer, whose family has actually been farming at Ranscombe since the 1970s. So my name is Ben, as you know, and I've been at Ranscombe since 2008. So I'm actually in my 13th year now. And prior to this job, I was working at a site immediately adjacent to Ranscombe. So I've known the site fairly well since 2004 and have seen all the many changes that have taken place here over the years. And as people may be watching this all over the UK and may not know the site at all, I'll just show you Ranscombe's location, which is in southeast England in the north of the county of Kent, and approximately 20-25 miles from central London. And here is a more local view showing the boundary of the reserve in yellow and its proximity to the settlements of Medway and Gravesend. It's a very densely populated area and a very busy area, with the A2, M2 running up to London and the high-speed rail link to the continent running parallel to that. But it is also it's an area of great importance for nature conservation. To the north and east, mostly out of shot, you've got the North Kent marshes on the Thames and Swale estuaries and Medway estuaries, which are very important for their migratory bird populations. But Ranscombe itself is situated almost at the northern tip of the Downs, AONB, above the Medway Valley. The North Downs being the range of chalk hills stretching from Surrey out in the west down to the to the White Cliffs of Dover on the coast in the east. So situated on the North Downs, Ranscombe is a 252 hectare, or if you prefer, 620 acre site, approximately half woodland and half agricultural land. And the majority of that agricultural land has largely, over the past century, been managed for arable, so for growing crops. Now, tenant farmer grows a range of commercial crops that typically include wheat, barley, beans, rape, linseed. Now, the tradition of arable farming is absolutely critical to the site's value for wild plant conservation, as the reserve is regarded as probably the most important site for arable plants in the whole UK. And there is a huge assemblage of arable plant species here, some of which have their largest UK populations at Ranscombe. So what do we mean when we say arable plants? Well, first of all, these plants are all what we call archaeophytes, which means they were introduced to the UK before the year 1500, but for the most part probably arrived, most likely by accident, with the introduction of food crops such as wheat and barley from the Middle East via mainland Europe some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So they're not truly native species, but they are very much part of our countryside and now form an important part of our ecosystem. They provide an essential source of pollen and nectar for bees, butterflies and other pollinators, and their seeds can support a huge population of small mammals and farmland birds. Secondly, these plants are all annuals, so they only last 1 year, typically setting seed at the end of the summer after they have flowered. Then new plants emerge in that autumn or the following spring. And their life cycle is closely linked to the farming year, traditionally growing alongside the crops that they came into this country with. Summer, the crop is growing, they set seed before the crop is harvested, then that seed is turned back into the soil as the ground is ploughed and harrowed before sowing next year's crop. Now, if the ground wasn't disturbed each year, then other more competitive perennial plants, such as grasses, would establish, and the much more specialist annuals would lose that bare soil habitat that they require. However, these arable plants have experienced severe declines and now make up one of the most threatened groups of plants in the UK. The problem has long been that these plants are an unwanted component of the crop when it's harvested, effectively being an impurity that farmers worked hard over the years to eradicate. Now, greater intensification of agriculture since the middle of the last century has included the use of powerful chemical herbicides that kill off many of the plants directly, and more effective fertilizers have helped enhance the growth of already more vigorous crop varieties, which leaves little or no space for these arable plants to thrive. Now, the result is that many of these plants have disappeared from the farm landscape altogether. So if we just look at a handful of the rare arable plants that we have at Ranscombe, first off, I've got here narrow-fruited corn salad, species that has undergone substantial declines over the past half century across the UK, but with the North Downs still an important area for this plant. It's rated as endangered in the UK, which is the second highest level of conservation concern. Corn cockle, this was a plant that was very common up to the end of the 19th century, and though it remains widely available in wildflower seed mixes, this was believed to have become extinct in the wild until it re-emerged at Ranscombe 1 year following a deep plough. So Ranscombe is in fact regarded as the only place where corn cockle does occur in the wild in the UK still. Blue pimpernel is actually a subspecies of the much more common scarlet pimpernel, which you can actually see alongside there. It is one of these things that has probably always been quite rare, as records have always been pretty sparse. And lastly, finally, fumetry, another annual that is mainly restricted to southern and eastern England. This has also seen big declines due to agricultural intensification since the middle of the last century, and is now classified as vulnerable in the UK, which is the third highest level of conservation concern. But Ranscombe is also home to a nice variety of grassland species as well, particularly those associated with chalk soils, and here are just a few of them. First off here, we've got meadow clary, one of our highlight species. Now, the first place it was ever recorded in the UK was actually at Ranscombe Farm way back in 1699. Now, we know that it was more widespread at Ranscombe back in as far back as the 1970s, actually, but these populations were lost as the open grassland that it occupied gradually became scrubbed over with trees. And after that, it largely clung on to small patches on the chalk slopes between the woodland and one of the arable fields. Secondly, you might be familiar with rock rose, which you get on chalk and limestone, depending on where in the country you are. It is found in patches of ancient chalk grassland at Ranscombe, and also on areas of bare chalk around some of the arable fields. Although fairly widespread, it is actually a plant that is now classified as near threatened in England. Burnet rose is a plant that's very rare in Kent, perhaps less so elsewhere, but it's normally elsewhere in the country. It tends to occur on coastal dunes and cliffs rather than on the grassland as it does at Ranscombe. Clustered bellflower is a very nice plant that flowers later in the season, still flowering in August and September when most of the other grassland flowers have gone over. It's a rare plant in Kent, and close to where it occurs, you also get two other species of the same family, maybe harebell and nettle-leaf bellflower. There are also at least 10 species of orchid at Ranscombe, which occupy a mixture of grassland and woodland habitats. Now, by far the most common is pyramidal orchid, which occurs in the thousands. But here are some of the most notable species, or the species of orchid of most conservation concern. Firstly, we have fly orchid there. This is an orchid that appears on chalk hills across southern England, and on limestone in the north of England. That used to be common in East Anglia as well, on calcareous fens, but largely died out when many of these were drained about a century ago. It's classed as vulnerable in the UK. A man orchid is a species that is mainly concentrated on the North Downs. Again, it used to be a lot more common in East Anglia, but many of those populations have been lost over the decades. The man orchid is actually classified as endangered. Lady orchid, again, predominantly on the North Downs. It was perhaps never particularly that common outside of Kent. Some populations existed on the North Downs, but on the South Downs, sorry. Much of them were gone by 20, 30 years ago. And again, this is nationally an endangered plant. And lastly, white helleborine, another chalk-loving orchid in southern and southeast England. It's closely associated with beech trees, and again, it's classed as vulnerable. So why is this site so important? Well, we believe a lot might have to do with the continuity in the landscape. So what we have here are two maps, one from 1797 above, and another one from near enough to the present day. Now, what I hope this shows you is the continuity in the landscape over time. So yes, there have been some very obvious changes, such as the urban encroachment and railways and roads, etc. But many of the features in the landscape actually remain unchanged or unchanged. Of particular note is this field and woodland boundary, which you can see on my marker there. It's a very distinctive pattern that is actually possible to see on an earlier map that we have going back to 1641. And you can also make out tracks through the woodland that still persist hundreds of years on. And it's no coincidence, I'm sure, that many of our most important plant species actually occur along these old historic lines. Now, it's worth pointing out here that this area called Mill Hill in the south of the site is a lot more heavily wooded today than it was in 1797, as hopefully you can see there. And what we see here is an area of probably former grazed chalk grass, and that was either planted up or was abandoned and allowed to scrub over, eventually turning into woodland. So when plant life took over the site, it looked a bit like this. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might notice that this Google Earth image is actually from May 2007. But broadly speaking, most of the features that we can see at this scale were similar in 2007 to how they had been 2 years earlier. Now, worth pointing out just here that the grey shaded area in the middle is where the old centre of Ranscombe Farm once was. Now they're private residences, so this area has nothing to do with our management of the reserve. But what I hope you can see from this image is that when plant life took the site on, it was still very much an intensive arable farm. So you see what used to be a crop of rapeseed dominating much of this middle area. Further arable cultivation down in the valley and on some of the southern slopes here. Now, the northern half of the site was occupied by this extensive area of ancient woodland, which was itself part of the Commonwealth Site of Special Scientific Interest, stretching further to the west. Now, this woodland was chiefly made up of sweet chestnut coppice. Now, coppicing, for those of you who don't know, is a traditional form of woodland management where trees are cut down at the base to obtain a usable crop of wood, and then allowed to regrow from the stump or stool, as we call it, after which, however many years, depending on the tree species and what you're wanting to use the wood for, the stems are then cut again. So as shown in the picture here, you get multiple stems growing out from each stool, which often grow straight and upwards where they are competing for the light. And broadly speaking, you can continue this cycle indefinitely, and many coppice stools can live to be hundreds of years old. Now, the trees we can see here, both those standing and the cut logs, are sweet chestnut that have been cut at around 25 years old. Now, sweet chestnut is not a tree native to Britain, originally coming from the Mediterranean. They were planted en masse across woodlands all over the southeast to provide a crop of long straight poles that used to grow hops for brewing beer. Now, at Ranscombe, most of the woodland in the north of the site was probably converted to chestnut coppice between about 100 and 200 years ago. And from this picture, you can see that in some areas of the woods, chestnut is pretty much the only tree species that's present. Now, although the market for hop poles largely disappeared by the middle of the last century, chestnut was still being coppiced for a range of products into the 1990s, including fencing materials and wood pulp, typically on a cutting cycle of maybe 15 to 30 years. But by the time plant I took over, the rate of cutting had slowed down significantly, and one of the key priorities for managing the woodlands at Ranscombe was to get regular coppice going again. Now, the importance of coppicing from a woodland conservation point of view is that when an area of coppice is felled, there is a sudden influx of light to the woodland floor, which gives a boost to ground floor that's been lying dormant between the coppice cycles. As the coppice regrows, it goes through several different stages. It provides habitat for a variety of wildlife, from dormouse to nightingales. Now, coppicing different areas of your woodland in different years creates a patchwork of different habitats, effectively as a byproduct of this traditional management practice. So at Ranscombe, as much in the ancient woodland atop the North Downs, like much of the woodlands of the North Downs, bluebells do very well from the ongoing coppice cycle. But it's worth pointing out that the past few years of regrowth following coppicing, there isn't actually a great deal of diversity there. Chestnut is a very fast growing tree with dense foliage, which quickly shades out other trees and plants. Also, it is an introduced species, and its value for wildlife when it occurs in big monocultures like this is actually quite limited. So much of the commons area had been converted to chestnut coppice, let's say. There wasn't a great deal of diversity in terms of species or structure. Now, you can make out these tracks through the woods here were really quite narrow, planted right up to the edges and creating lots of shady conditions. Now, relative to the area, there weren't an awful lot of mature trees in the woods, and you can actually see these individual oak trees actually dotted amongst the coppice there. The greatest concentrations of old and mixed growth were along what we call the town road, and along the old boundary along the southern edge of the woods that we saw. Now, the town road is so called as it was part of a route that formerly ran east, crossing the River Medway to the city of Rochester. Some 200 years ago, it was planted with this informal avenue of hornbeam trees, a species that already occurred naturally and of which there are still several much older specimens surviving. Now, hornbeam is a species, and in fact, the local area was thought to have one of the best concentrations of veteran hornbeam in the country, if not actually most of Europe. Now, the woodland in the southern half of the site, occurring on the chalk slopes, tends to be much more mixed in character, being made up of smaller woodland shores and including areas of ancient woodland, later planting, and secondary woodland. So that's areas that have developed into woodland after open areas are gradually scrubbed over. So Mill Hill was one such area, containing a nice variety of woodland and scrub habitats. And as you can see here, is home to also some rather nice beech trees. And Mill Hill is also one of the most botanically rich parts of the reserve, and in particular importance for orchids. Now, in terms of other land uses beyond commercial, arable and woodland, where there was some grassland here, an area of improved pasture on the steep southern slopes called the Knock, that the farmer used for cattle grazing. But the only area of species-rich grassland on the reserve was a very small patch down at the southeastern end of Mill Hill. Now, the remainder of what was probably a much larger expanse to the west until probably the mid-19th century, so out this way. Now, in terms of the rare arable plants, Kitchenfield was the only part of the site solely dedicated to them. Now, where they existed elsewhere on the site, these tended to be in small pockets around the edges of fields and would be occurring largely by accident rather than by design. Now, because of its known importance for rare arable plants, Kitchenfield had been subject to a management agreement between the farmer and the government body English Nature, which is now Natural England, since 1985. Now, under this agreement, the farmer was required to cultivate the field like an arable field, but to use no fertilizers, not even organic fertilizers, and certainly no herbicides. So over winter, Kitchenfield would appear something like this. So you can really see how chalky the soil is, which in many of these cases of many of the arable plants, they're able to tolerate this very well. until they thrive. And now in some cases, it's hardly what you would even necessarily call soil at all. It's more like sort of bare chalk rubble, but which again is perfect for many of these arable rarities. And come June, July time, this is what kitchen field typically looks like in full flower. You often get this fantastic bunch of poppies, which is very evocative image now, of course, and very much associated nowadays with remembrance in the First World War and so on the Western Front. But there's no coincidence there, since the constant churning up of the ground due to shelling in that conflict would have had a similar effect to that of cultivation in these plants to regenerate year on year. Now, there are 5 species of poppy occurring at Ranscombe, with common poppy being by far the most numerous and responsible for these colourful displays. Now, other years, kitchen field may feature fewer poppies and be mainly white, with a plant called stinking chamomile, and another rare plant, but which can form the main ground cover over much of this field on occasion. But as well as this excellent visual display, many of the often smaller and rarer plants occur in the spaces. So, having given you a quick overview of where we were in 2005, I'm just going to skip forward in the time machine to 2020. Okay, so to where we are roughly now. And just to talk you through some of the key management activities that we have undertaken, starting with what we've just been looking at, that's the arable plants. So the main focus of arable plant conservation in 2005, as I say, was kitchen field. Now, a key priority early on was to increase the area of land on the reserve that was managed for these plants. There were other parts that were very similar to kitchen field in terms of their soil and aspects and so on. And based on how well we know the seed of arable plants to remain viable in the soil, there was every reason to suggest the plants in the reserve could be every bit as good. So we worked with the farmer to sign up to what was then called the High Level Stewardship Scheme, which was an environmental stewardship scheme for landowners run by Natural England that paid financial incentives for management undertaken for nature. In the farmer's case, these incentives are really financial compensation, as he was effectively taking land out of production in order to provide habitat for rare arable plants. However, there is some synergy in all this. Broadly speaking, the land that is best for arable plants tends to be that on the steeper slopes with thin, chalky soils, which are harder to farm and require more costly fertilizer in order to be productive. Whereas the more productive arable land tends to be on the flatter slopes with richer clay soils, which in turn are not so good for arable plants. So it sort of balances out. So in fields such as Longhose, down there, and the area immediately below the North Downs Way footpath, these areas were both at various points after 2008 taken entirely out of arable production. Now, both of these are steep, south-facing, very chalky fields, and I think I'd be right in saying that the farmer is probably happier being given a guaranteed payment to farm these for nature, rather than having the physical and financial effort of getting viable crops. Now, that's not to say he's getting paid to do nothing. Of course, he's not at all. These fields still need to be cultivated, and that, of course, takes time and effort. But what he isn't doing is he's not applying fertilizers or herbicides, and that's what allows the arable plants to thrive. Now, having had some good outcomes in these new areas, it's since been possible through later incarnations of stewardship schemes and so on to roll out further conservation arable across the whole of the valley in the south of the reserve. And on top of that, through the current scheme, he also cultivates individual plots within areas of new grassland and 6 metre wide margins around some of the commercial arable fields. Now, these margins serve to provide some nice flower-rich buffers around the fields of crops and also provide connectivity that allows plant seed to move between the larger areas of conservation arable. So, if we look back at some of the arable plants that I mentioned earlier, I'll just chat through some of the impacts that this management has had on them. But the important thing to say, first of all, is that because, of course, these are annuals, their numbers do fluctuate year on year based on all kinds of factors, from the time of year that cultivation is carried out to the type of cultivation, whether deep ploughing or just disking the surface, to, of course, weather conditions. But narrow-fruited corn salad in the top left Now, a plant that wasn't even in Kitchenfield originally, but instead which was on in small pockets along field edges, now appears regularly all the way through Longhouse Field and along other chalky slopes in the south of the reserve, often reaching population numbers in the tens of thousands quite easily. Corn cockle, that's now well established in Longhouse Field as well as Kitchenfield, having been previously restricted to Kitchenfield, where we still see healthy numbers appearing. And the seed is heavier and less mobile, so it doesn't tend to spread as quickly as some of the other plants, but it most likely moved to its new location in Longhouse Field on the wheels of the tractor as the farmer went from field to field. Finally, if you read down the bottom right, that's a plant that has also benefited very much from management in Longhouse Field, and that's increased its range from virtually nothing, and in some years appearing again in the many thousands. Now, Blue Pimpernel is an interesting case in the bottom left, as numbers of this have always been pretty low actually, apart from one particular year in 2012. And it responded very well to Kitchenfield being ploughed up deeply rather than just disked over. And also it was ploughed in the spring rather than the autumn. And that following summer, over 7,000 plants appeared. But however, always been possible to replicate that spring cultivation very much. So it just goes to show that what is good for some things often isn't quite so good for others. And there is still quite a lot, there's a lot for us to learn about how many of these plants do actually behave and what suits them. Now, a plant I haven't yet mentioned is this one, broadleaf cudweed. Now, in 2005, it was thought that Kitchenfield alone was home to 95% of the entire UK population of this UK endangered plant. Now, it certainly isn't the most stunning to look at, but nationally, this is extremely rare. It appears to set seed prolifically, and the seed is very mobile, so it quickly exploited a lot of the new conservation arable habitat. And the population is regularly in the tens of thousands. In fact, it has been estimated to be in the millions of years. And as you can see in this picture here, you can see it often quite easily forms the main ground cover. But it has occurred across most parts of the reserve now, in disturbed areas in grassland, even in the woodland, in fact, which goes to show just how these plants don't differentiate between habitat types. If the conditions are right, then they will grow. And also, what is interesting about this whole process is that what we're actually doing for these species isn't actually very much in practical terms. I mean, apart from the planning involved and the work and commitment from the farmer and ourselves, in essence, all you're actually doing is cultivating the ground and not applying chemicals. And once those conditions are created and in place, nature and population expand quite easily under their own steam. Now, looking at grassland, now if you recall back in 2005, the only areas of permanent grassland were this graze field called the Knock, down the bottom there, and a small patch at Mill Hill. The small patch at Mill Hill was a very high quality piece of species-rich chalk grass and contained plants such as horseshoe vetch, rock rose, man orchid, even harebell. This fragment was most likely once part of a much larger area of chalk grassland extending westwards. But much of this had, from the mid-19th century, either been planted with trees or been abandoned and gradually scrubbed over and developing into woodland. Similarly, an area at the northern end of Kitchenfield, that was by 2005 very much covered with trees, had also until the 1940s been open grass and scrub. In fact, this was one of the previous sites where meadow clary was recorded in the 1970s. And again, this area contained populations of rare and important plants. Now, these plant populations were surviving in small pockets, quite vulnerable to further declines, with very little chance of increasing their ranges beyond. So what we did was to restore grassland in these areas, doubling the extent of the Mill Hill patch, and more gradually creating up to a couple of acres at the top of Kitchenfield. So here is Mill Hill with the original grassland area on the left and the scrub that had grown up since the 1940s on the right. Now, we were already managing the existing patch of grassland by mowing at the end of the summer once the seed had set, then raking up the cuttings to prevent smothering and nutrient buildup in the soil. But we have evidence, or we had evidence from old maps, old photos, as well as first-hand anecdotal evidence that this area too was previously grassland. And in fact, there were even a few non-flowering rosettes of man orchid that you were poking up through the ivy-covered ground in there. So we cleared the scrub, felling the trees using our team of volunteers and a contractor, then got a machine in to grind out the stumps and scrape off the top layer of material. Now, all that accumulated ivy and leaf litter that would otherwise inhibit recolonization of grassland species, we got rid of. And we did a similar thing at the top of a kitchen field, only over a longer period. Now, what is interesting here is that in the 1970s, the farmer had installed a rabbit fence along the top of the arable field, and where the area behind had scrubbed over, it developed into what was in effect a natural hedge. And after we cleared the scrub with the volunteers, we got a contractor in to grub out the fence and the tree stump, effectively these two parts of kitchen field once more. And this created this very nice disturbed chalky soil along the front edge of the grass, and which would have been home to all kinds of dormant plant seed, which included ground pine, which is another endangered species. It's another annual that is well suited to chalky soil, and it really benefited from this disturbance of the seed bank. Now, the fence and scrub were grubbed out in early 2014, and in the summer of 2015, lo and behold, another 150 ground pine plants could be found along this edge, having been just a handful before that. Now, as well as restoring these smaller, rich, species-rich fragments of grassland, we've also create much lower. So we extended the reserve in 2000 council, and through his stewardship scheme, we got the farm to take out both a 20-acre field and part of the long hose field, take those both out of production and revert them back to grassland. Now, Brockles had been arable field up until the 1990s, when it went into the set-aside scheme that some of you may remember from years back. In the years before Plant Life took it over, it gradually reverted to grass, and the seed migrated in from the field edges and the surrounding land. It was grass and quite rich in nutrients, due to its history as a fertilised arable field, and it was also one that became easily overgrown with scrub. So 20-acre and the eastern end of Long Hose were as arable fields with the intention that they would recolonise naturally with grassland species rather than introducing imported grass seed mixes. Now, 20-acre field was particularly important as meadow clearing occurs along the top edge of that field, and creating more suitable grassland habitat here would provide a lot more security to the population and also create potential new habitat for it to spread into. However, these former arable fields would take a long time to become as good as the corresponding smaller fragments, as they had long been managed as arable and would still contain a high concentration of nutrient. They're also reliant on the seeded grassland species finding their way in. What we ultimately want to achieve is for the assemblages of plants in those small species-rich pockets to spread into these newer, larger areas of grassland where there is a potential to establish really big, robust populations. And this is unlikely to be something that happens without active intervention. For example, at Mill Hill, there are little populations of grassland species dotted along a series of glades through the woodland, such as patches of horseshoe vetch that's halfway up. But these haven't really increased their ranges at all in, say, 15 years. So to try and kickstart this colonisation, we've actually been employing the use of spreading green hay. Now, green hay spreading is a fairly standard meadow creation or restoration technique. And here we have our volunteer team mowing and then raking off the cuttings, in this case at the top of the kitchen field. And at the end of the summer, so it's raked up and bagged up, and then you can take them in the builder's bags up to new meadow sites in the trailer. here in Brocklesfield, and they're unloaded, and the material is then spread thinly over the recently cut field, where hopefully the seed will drop and hopefully establish. Now, I'm only really skimming over meadow creation here, by the way, and Plant Life has got a lot more resources that you can look up if you want to know more about that. But since we started this back in 2017, results have been promising so far, though it tends to take a couple of summers before you start to see the new plants flowering. It's also quite a labour-intensive method, so there is a limit to how much plant material you can realistically move. Though hopefully what will happen is that once new populations have become established, the needs will themselves increase their range within the naturally they'll increase this within these new areas of grassland. Now, what will hopefully provide instead a much more self-sustaining and reliable method of moving seed about is grazing, specifically cattle grazing. Now, grazing is a key part of managing these big new areas of grassland anyway, as being norm knowers. But before we established the water supply and the fencing in Brocklesfield to enable the grazing, we did actually have the whole 60 acres cut mechanically. And this was very expensive as the field was very scrubby with little or no value as hay crops. So cutting really is not a cost-effective form of management for us. But there are also many other benefits to grazing over mowing beyond simply the cost. When they graze, cattle produce a varied sward of different heights and densities, providing lots of different habitat niches for plants, birds, mammals, invertebrates. Importantly, cattle poach up the ground where they walk, creating patches of bare ground, again providing niches into which some of these rarer chalkgrass and plants are able to set seed. There are other ecological benefits for cattle. Other ecological benefits from cattle provided by their manure as well. And of course, the cattle, they have an economic value as livestock, so they ultimately pay for themselves being there. The farmer owns the cattle and needs to go into the food chain. So we started grazing Brocklesfield in 2013, and this was soon divided into two different compartments so that we could control the timings of it and keep half the field ungrazed during the summer months when everything was in flower. We then introduced grazing to the 20-acre field. Now, this is particularly important in the early stages of transition from arable for keeping under control some of the more vigorous perennial weeds that otherwise dominate, while the grasses take time to establish. But then we undertook further funded projects to get grazing into the kitchen field. Both the restored grassland at the top and the conservation arable too. Now, the reason for grazing the arable is that once everything is finished flowering and set seed, grazing is again a good tool for controlling some of the invasive perennial weeds that otherwise needs to be sprayed off with chemicals. Now, importantly though, what we'd created now was a connected system of grazed fields that we could move cattle between, which starts to create these important ecological linkages across the site as the animals move seed about on their coats and on their feet. In addition, a local charitable trust were able to get project funding to fence another restored species-rich chalkland grassland site just outside of the reserve, which is a remnant of what was once a much larger area of open grassland called Warren Plain. And we could link directly from here to Brockles, and then the cattle can now move freely between the two for a few weeks in the autumn. Now, lastly, to connect the original bit of grazing land at the Knock to all the other grazing land, we had this fenced drove route installed, which allows the animals to be driven right across the reserve, helping to create further ecological linkages and also making all our jobs a lot easier moving the cattle about between the fields. So here we have some cattle moving between Brockles and Warren Plain. And these are mainly Sussexes and Angus's. The farmer mainly has native breed cattle at Ranscombe that are happy living outdoors all year round and happy surviving on rough pasture, including a lot of the scrub that needs eaten down in Brockles. Now, the drove route I mentioned actually continued beyond that fence section that links the fields together. We also had a digger scrape off the topsoil to a width of about 5 meters for around 300 meters along the northern edge of the 20-acre field. And this replicated the sort of tracks that herd animals often create when they move about. And the idea was to generate bare chalk habitat that would be good for annual plants. Now, as you can see, the cattle have been walking up and down this over the winter. This area immediately above the drove is home to one of our meadow clary populations up there, and it's hoped that in time this drove may benefit the spread of this species. And the drove has already been very productive, actually, with broadleaf cudweed appearing along it with one species, and also this plant, rough mallow, which is another chalk-loving annual. And it occurs in several locations across the reserve. It likes that disturbance, and often once conditions become sedentary and grass over, it disappears. The sort of regular annual created by the cattle drove is probably just what it needs for sustaining that population. Incidentally, rough mallow is another plant that, like meadow clary, was first recorded in the UK at Ranscombe Farm, only that time in 1792. Now, a network of grass margins has also been established around many of the commercial arable fields, again, through the Farmer Stewardship Scheme, and typically 6 metres wide, like the conservation arable margins. They're left unsprayed to act as buffer strips to support a range of wildlife, particularly in that zone between the farmed arable land and the woodland edge. They are on the whole less important for rare plant species, as many are located on the richer clay soil, but are very good for producing healthy populations of nectar-rich flowering plants that support lots of insects, including bees, which Ranscombe is also very good for. So what has this work for grassland achieved? Well, one way we could assess this is by looking at the changes in population of one species, one of our key species, man orchid, over the past 10 years or so. And we can see that in 2010, here, for instance, there were 85 plants in the grass that looks like a kitchen field up there. An initial scrub clearance was carried out in 2005, of course, and then more extensively between 2010 and 2014. And then grazing was introduced there from 2015. And the plants have responded very well here. By 2020, the maximum number of man orchids being recorded here since 2010 had more than doubled to 184. Now, at Mill Hill, where there were much fewer plants, the ongoing management of the chalkgrass and bare and the over doubling in habitat size has again led to a doubling in population. Also, the population down in the car park, actually down here, which is also steadily increased. That's a steadily increased with regular cutting of the chalk bank where they occur down there. So we've certainly seen an upward trend in overall population size in the places where man orchid was already occurring. But what about expanding their range into the new areas of grassland? Well, for the first time, we recorded 39 new man orchid plants in Brockles Field last year. Now, it's impossible to know exactly how these have been brought in, whether by the green hay spreading or moved by the action of grazing cattle or even just by the wind. But that's kind of less important than the fact that we know there is now suitable habitat in Brockles Field for man orchid, and a small but nonetheless well-established population. And there is every reason to suggest, based on how man orchid has increased elsewhere at Ranscombe, and indeed on evidence from other known sites locally, that there could continue to spread within population habitat in Brockles and ultimately go on to become the main population on the reserve. Now, as for man orchid in 20 acre, well, we haven't seen it there yet, but it may simply be that it hasn't found its way there yet, or we may just not spotted it yet. What we haven't yet attempted, and what is also on the to-do list, is to try spreading green hay from this population down at the car park onto Long Hose Field above. Now, lastly, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing in the woodlands at Ranscombe. Now, I did explain earlier how in 2005, much of the woodland in the north of the reserve was very shady, and only where trees were coppiced did you get much light into the woods, and that tended to be fairly temporary as the trees grew back rapidly. There were very few permanent open areas within the woods, and this was significantly limiting the diversity of both plants and other wildlife. So what we have done is effectively widened a lot of the woodland tracks, or rides as we call them, by felling trees to a width of up to 30 metres in places, and also opening up new glades. Now this creates a network across the woodland connecting to other open habitats such as grassland and arable field edge. In many cases, we're brought in large machinery to grind out the stumps in order to create a clear surface to the rides that allow them to be mown and kept open permanently. And so you can see here a before and after shot of these rides. This is pretty much the same view, the left taken in 2010, just before this area was opened up, and on the right from almost the same position several years later in about 2017. And on the right, you can see where the chestnut coppice, and following the work to remove the stumps, it's gradually recolonised with grasses and other plants. Now, the unmown back edges have been allowed to scrub up naturally with self-sown birch and willow. And there is also now space for these mature oak trees here that were previously being suffocated by the surrounding chestnut coppice. So in a fairly short space of time, we can already see a much greater variety in the structure of the woodland. Now, while on the whole, there are perhaps fewer plant species of high conservation concern as compared with the arable land and the grassland, what we have seen in creating these wide rides is a massive increase in the more common plant species. So many of these rides, particularly in the early stages of development, before they get very grassy, are soon colonised by large numbers of wild strawberry, which you've got on the left, and violets on the right. And other species such as nettle-leaf bellflower, marsh thistles and primroses, they also do very well along these rides, providing good nectar sources for insects. In fact, violets are the plant that silver-wash fritillary butterflies lay their eggs on. And we first spotted silver-wash fritillary back in 2011. And since then, the numbers of these woodland specialists have really rocketed. Now they're a common sight flying up and down all of these rides in July every year. And now another way that we've been trying to improve the diversity of the woodland has been to coppice the woodland edges over a total of about 6 kilometres. So instead of having a hard edge of tall trees going right up against the field, which tends to create very shady conditions and leaves little light for any undergrowth, we aim to develop something more like this. And what I hope this shows is a development of dense scrub a few years following edge coppicing. Now, the edge consisting of a wide range of species with a varied structure, which are very good for nesting birds and small mammals. And this is also carried out in conjunction with management of many of our field edges, which are left uncut so that the bramble undergrowth can spread out from the woodland and create habitat that is excellent for species such as harvest mice and others. And also along some of these edges on chalky soils, it's often less brambly, but you get really nice swathes of plants like this small scabious. Now, in the ancient cottonwoods in the north, there were just a few concentrations of mature and veteran trees, I said earlier, the town road and the section along the southern edge. But others are fairly sparsely dotted around the woods, mainly along the tracks and edges. And we started to connect up these areas by beginning to convert whole areas of chestnut coppice back into mixed species woodland. Now, I say back, as of course the chestnut was only planted up some 200 years ago, so this is possibly returning it to something more akin to what it once was. But to do this, we've been actively controlling the chestnut coppice regrowth after felling and allowing other trees to recolonise naturally, which includes a wide range of species, including oak, hornbeam, hawthorn, holly, goat willow, birch, hazel. So across these areas marked in brown, we've started this process. You can see these also integrated with the woodland ride and glade network, but they also tie into some of the botanically richest areas of the woodland. So the area to the east, for example, is one of our key areas for lady orchid. And here you can see that particular area of the woods, and hopefully you can see that where these old chestnuts, coppice stalks have been killed off, and some of the new growth that is colonising the area, including birch. And within these guards are naturally regenerated oak saplings. Now, the reason why we guard them is partly to help prevent deer damage, but also so that we can remember where they are. As though the area looks pretty bare now, it will quickly scrub over with other faster growing tree species and of course lots of bramble. Now, I mentioned lady orchid being present in this area of the woods, A key part of the management to increase tree diversity is also to create a much greater variety of structure as well as just species, with different tree species growing at different rates. Now, this replaces the very rapid and uniform regrowth of chestnut coppice, and will in turn hopefully support a wider range of woodland plant species. Now, a long-term goal of this work to restructure the woodland is also to create a whole new generation of mature and veteran trees, particularly oak. And we've been working to halo a lot of the existing old oak trees, such as here. So that's clearing around them to reduce the suffocating effects of being surrounded by all that coppice. Now, what we would like to see is a woodland much more dominated by trees like this in the future. But I think we have to accept actually that regardless of what we do now, in the time frames, so this is obviously something that we'll never be, none of us will ever be around to see. Now, just to finish this presentation off, I'd just like to go back and quickly summarise the main activities that we have undertaken at Ranscombe since 2005, using the maps again, that bring us up to where we are now. So, so in summary, we still have this central core of very productive commercial farmland in the middle, and much of this is bounded by grass buffer strips to enhance the wildlife diversity. But in the south of the site, on the chalk slopes, there was a large proportion of former arable land that, like the original kitchen field in the west, is now dedicated solely to the conservation of arable plants. Also on the chalk, there are large areas of grassland under restoration, now integrated with the older historic species-rich pieces of grassland. Grazing is then used as a tool to manage these habitats and further enhance the dynamics across the landscape, helping to move plant seed about and so on, whilst also generating a product in outdoor reared beef cattle. Then the woodland, much of which is still coppiced and generates a financial return, is gradually becoming more and more diversified through creating a network of wildlife-rich permanent open habitat, and by converting areas of chestnut coppice back into mixed broadleaf woodland. And we have already seen a lot of very positive results from this management so far, but we should say it is still only early days, really. Interestingly, someone once told me that it takes about 15 years to get a nature reserve going, and I don't really know what he meant by that or where he got that number from. Thought he just picked it out of the air, but there might be some truth to that, because it's certainly in the last year or two, sort of 15 years on from when planters took on the site, changes taking place as the effects of the management to date are fully kicking in and gaining a sort of momentum of their own. So hopefully we'll be seeing much more in the future and seeing Ranscombe go on from strength to strength. And I believe that now brings us to the end of this presentation. Probably gone a little bit over time, but if anyone's got any questions, we'll hopefully answer them.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. First of all, a very quick apology. I know that the quality wasn't always brilliant. I think Felicity's probably done quite a good job in trying to keep people up to speed with what Ben's been saying, but apologies for the sometimes in and out internet connections. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben, for your enthusiasm. I think that's pretty clear to everybody. I've got a little series of questions that people have been asking as you've been going along. I want to ask the first one, though. What's your favourite species at Ranscombe? You're only allowed one.
Oh, possibly. Oh, blimey. Possibly man orchid.
Man orchid. There we go.
Yeah. Or lady. I don't know, actually.
Man orchid or lady.
Either, both of those two.
So a few questions, I think, from the folk who've been listening. From Trevor Mountford, who asked if we collect seeds from the wildflowers at all.
Well, it's a tricky one. To some degree, yes. Most of the seed that is collected tends to be seed that is actually collected as a kind of a backup. So I mentioned earlier that corncockle sometimes when blue penpennel did very well, corncockle didn't do so well. And corncockle seed was actually collected in order to, in case, because it was it's such an important population, if that was to sort of disappear, then it's collected as a sort of backup so that you don't actually then, you know, lose it completely in the worst case scenario. But as a rule, generally though, in case sort of taking it and giving it out and spreading it and so on, that's not been something that we've really been involved in. But I mean, it's, you know, we spread it about the site, within the site a bit, but we largely, you know, we're into sort of allowing the sort of natural processes in the seed bank to do the work.
Great, thank you. And then a question from, I think it was from Sally Webster. I was just wondering about the use of cattle wormers in the stocks that are on the site and whether that's restricted at all.
I don't know, because they belong to our tenant and he manages that. I'm not entirely sure if it's sort of, you know, whatever medicines they are. I mean, interestingly, he always used to, he whether he still does or not, I know years ago he used to use homeopathic treatments on his cattle anyway. And I don't know how much that would impact, you know, what that would impact on the sort of use of wormers and things like that. I mean, I don't think that. I think ultimately the any sort of impacts of anything like that probably isn't major in the overall benefit of having grazing animals on the site.
And I think overall it's fair to say, and I know you mentioned that the tenant at Ranscombe quite reasonably. This is somebody that we've been working with for sort of 10 or 15 years now, who's really committed to the site, and yes, does use homeopathic remedies wherever he can. So and Sally, if you'd like more details, you know, we'll keep in touch on that.
Any information anyone wants, then get in touch.
Absolutely, yeah. Couple of other questions, because I know we haven't got very much time, so I'm keen to try and get as many of the queries that have come in as possible. I had a question about what's the best time of the year to visit Ranscombe, and you're not allowed to say all of the year.
Probably June, July, I guess, for those really colourful displays of poppy fields and all that kind of thing. Maybe slightly into May, August, but June, July.
May, June, July. In the sunshine, preferably. Another couple of questions. How big an impact is there from deer browsing within the woodland? Is that seen as a major issue on the site?
Not too bad at the minute. It's something we always keep an eye on. We're not affected too much, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. The numbers aren't huge in our area, but yeah, it's something that we keep an eye on.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then a couple of questions. I think there was one about open days on the site, and also a question about the sort of accessibility to the public, and what's the situation with the site?
There's I mean, open days and things, we have had things go on in the past. Obviously, this last year has been a bit of a no-no for obvious reasons, but the accessibility, there's 10 miles of footpaths over the whole site anyway. There's a car park down at the entrance, but there's probably about at least 10 entrances around the edge anyway. Let's say about 10 miles of footpath. Also, some of those are permissive for horses and cycles, and we do have nearer the entrance, some of the paths are surfaced and flatter generally, so that to allow for people with access, you know, more limited access to limited mobility, etc., so that they can hopefully see some of the nice things that we've got there as well, and the nice plants and nice views and that are fairly spread evenly across the site. You know, it's not like you only the best bits are right over the most inaccessible bits. There's something everywhere.
And I think it's fair to say, Ben, I don't know the site anywhere near as well as you, but it is, you know, there's a phenomenal site to visit. It's open all of the time, free access to anybody who wants to go. And there's a huge amount of work being done alongside the conservation work to improve the sort of physical access for people around the site. And there are benches at various places where you can pretend to stop and look at the
need another day, another hour to yabber on about it, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's been very interesting over the last few months just to see how many more people are using the site and obviously appreciating it. So it's a whole other area of our work there which we could talk about, but really important, and it's, you know, it's really important to us that people get out to these sites and actually enjoy them as well and see what the work that's happened. I've got one or two other quick ones, I think, before we run out of time, Ben, if that's okay. Obviously, you've got a rather large motorway next to the site. There's a question as to whether or not we think the presence of the major roads has a major effect on the site itself. Any views on that?
Hard to know, isn't it? I mean, I think there's a lot, lot more talked about sort of the impacts of pollution, nitrogen, things and stuff on wildlife and plants and so on. And I think probably not an awful lot, actually, in reality. I think probably most of the plants, most of our key species are actually things that probably do okay. What we don't get a lot there is sort of lichens and things like that, which regionally they're probably not bigger, significance anyway in the southeast. And they might be the things that would get most affected by air pollution and so on. I don't think it impacts too much. If you took the motorway away, who knows? But I don't think it has too much of an impact on pollution and air quality and so on.
Right, fair enough. And I think we've probably just about got time for one more, because we've kind of run out of time, I'm afraid. But so I've got a question here that have grasslands been restored in the same areas where it existed many years ago? Is that how you've targeted?
That's what we've tried to. Yeah, I mean that's what we tried to do. Generally, we know Brockles was definitely wattle grassland at one stage. The top of Kitchen Field was a 20-acre bit. We're not so sure as, and the meadow clary occurred at the top of 20 acres, so you would think that there was grassland habitat up there, even if the whole field wasn't. Yeah, I'm sure that probably was. I mean, I guess they used to, back in the day, they probably used to rotate things a bit more anyway. I'm sure most of it probably, yeah, we tend to try and build in that historical connectivity and that continuity.
Great, thank you, Ben. I said that was the last one. I've got one final one, which I think I know the answer to, and is slightly difficult, but can the site be reached by public transport? What's the best way of reaching the site by public transport?
It can. There is actually a bus stop just outside, and there's actually a train station at Cuxton, which is only a short 5-minute walk down the road. It is possible. It's not totally obvious, but it is possible. And if anyone wanted to get in touch with us and ask for more details of bus numbers and so on like that, I don't know about times, but certainly, yeah, then please get in touch with us.
Great. Thank you very, very much indeed, Ben. Thank you, I think, for everybody who's joined us. And I hope it's inspired you to support us more and to get out to Ranscombe and other sites in your area. So once again, thank you very, very much. For those whose questions we haven't been able to answer, we'll try and get answers to you if we possibly can. But thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, and hope you all have a very good rest of this beautiful spring day.
Well done, Ben. Have you got the end button? You're still on live.
I know I am.
Finding the button.